thank you so much for coming tonight and joining us as we present our brand new program, The Story of the British in Russia. And you have just heard, an 18th century Irish song, which we performed in Irish, wasn't it?
Broadway, yes.
Yes, it's Irish Gaelic. It's Irish Gaelic, yes. And before we begin the presentation, we want to say a few words about what we do, who we are, and what we do. So basically, if you haven't seen our projects before, what we try and achieve is to combine educational talks and music. So basically, we do a variety of talks about English culture, the English language, and we try to combine it with lots of beautiful English and Scottish music, and we focus specifically on historical, medieval, ethnic, folk music. And so tonight, you're going to hear a lot of English, but also Scottish music. And also, before we proceed with the program, I want to say thanks to people who are behind this program today and who helped to make it happen. I first want to say a big thank you to Father Malcolm for hosting us tonight and for making it possible. I also want to say a huge thank you to Michael Gibson with so many things, including the slides tonight. Michael is a very active member of the British community, and he helps put together a lot of events at St.AndrewsChurch. I also want to say huge thanks to Helen Watson, who was a big inspiration behind this program, because Helen is actually someone who knows a lot about the history of the British community in Russia, but also about the history of St. Andrews. And she was the lady who took some of you on a tour up the church tower tonight. So big thank you to Helen. But also to Pat Davis Simchek, for also helping us put it together. And Pat has a little announcement to make for everyone. So Pat, could you please come up here for a minute?
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome you all to St. Andrews and thank those who supported our tower tour with Helen earlier. You each bought probably about 25% of the brick that will be basically put towards our restoration program, our historic restoration program, which began this year. Two notes. First, our Christmas Bazaar is on the 1st of December. It's basically traditional English mince pies. There will be mulled wine, food from various nations, and all sorts of Christmas gift ideas. So that will be from noon until 5 on the 1st of December here at St. Andrews. And lastly, because the pastor is sitting here looking at me, I do have to tell you that the most important thing we do here is on Sundays at 8:30 and 11 o'clock, our services here in English language, according to the Church of England procedures, and you're all welcome if you'd like to come on a Sunday. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat. And I believe we are ready to proceed with the program tonight. So the story of the British in Russia. We're going to talk about how the British first arrived in Russia and why they kept coming back to Moscow, St. Petersburg, and well, now the Russian Federation. And I actually want to ask you, I mentioned that we're going to sing a lot of Scottish music tonight. Can you maybe guess why we want to make such an emphasis on Scottish music with reference to the British history in Russia?
Maybe we were told that Scots just plays a great role in establishing this church.
That's actually very true, because in fact, the Scots made up the most of the British community in Moscow before the Soviet Revolution, and some of the prominent Scottish families contributed greatly towards building this church in the 19th century. In fact, St. Andrew is the patron saint of Scotland. And that's actually why we're going to make, like I said, we're going to make a great emphasis on Scottish music tonight and sing a lot of folk Scottish songs. Now, the relations between Russia and Britain go way back. I mean, they go centuries back. And we have interacted intensively and made important mutual contributions into our culture, trade, business, industries. Today, the relationship, it leaves to be desired, but I think it's very important to remember how much we have mutually contributed. And just remember this history that we share and that we have in common. And so we're going to travel back in time, and first, to start us off, we want to perform a very special song, which is probably one of the oldest songs in England. And it is actually a Christmas song. I know it's not Christmas yet, but it's coming. And this song represents a very interesting genre called the lullaby carols. And this song dates back to the 14th century. We're going to sing it in Middle English. That is the one, exactly. It's called As I Lay on Yule's Nicht, means As I Lay on Yule's Night. We're going to perform it in Middle English, and basically this is a kind of a dialogue between a baby and a mother. And as we hear the song, we learn that the baby is actually baby Jesus, and the mother is, of course, Mother Mary. So, As I Lay on Yule's Night, are we ready?
La 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 la
time to introduce the rest of the band. So can I please introduce to everyone Franziska Kavru. She is our vocalist and keyboard player. Nadezhda Petrushina. The Celtic harp, as well as recorders. Inna Bogorevskaya. Inna plays the keyboards as well as the recorders and percussion. Makar Havrun. Our percussionist. And finally, last but not least, Oleg Boyko. Lute player, so we are honored to have him with us tonight. Now, I just wanted to say very quickly that all the songs that we play, we usually create our versions. So these are all historical songs, but we either improvise or create our own arrangements. So what you have heard right now is our own version of this 14th century song. Now, back to the 16th century. And let's explore a little bit what happened in the 16th century and how the English people first arrived in Russia and why. Can we have the next slide, please, Mike? Next one, please. Next one. Okay. Right, so the 16th century was a very interesting time in Europe, as we all know, the time of great geographic discoveries. European, people in Europe were actively discovering the rest of the world, traveling, making new contacts, trading, and getting rich, and pursuing. And so there were lots of adventurers and merchants traveling around the world. Now the English at that point were kind of lagging behind in the way that they weren't yet the great empire they later became. They didn't have their colonies yet, and they were very, very much interested in getting places. And so, of course, India was one of the very important destinations, because this is where the very expensive products, spices, came from. So everybody wanted to get to India. And so the English people were trying to find their own route to India. And so they decided to try the northern route. And King Edward VI, who was then a boy of 13, wrote letters to kings of different countries saying that there is going to be a mission, a friendly mission of merchants, and that they will be trying to establish contacts with other countries. And so a first joint venture company was created called the Merchant Adventurers Company, and it was set up by 3 adventurers, including Richard Chancellor, who found the money to build 3 ships and explore the northern route. Unfortunately, the one ship got lost, and then nobody on board the ship survived, but the 2 other ships made it to the shores of Russia. However, that's the thing, they were aiming for India, but they ended up near the shores of Russia. And this was around the area of modern Arkhangelsk, the city of Arkhangelsk. And this is where they were found by Russian fishermen and taken to Moscow. So I think they were pretty lucky that they got as far as Moscow. And they actually ended up meeting Tsar Ivan the Terrible. Question, do you think Ivan the Terrible was happy to see the English tradesmen? No, you're not sure. Actually, he was delighted because Russia had no sea routes that it could trade through. And so to have people come and offer trading opportunities was a bit of luck. So Ivan the Terrible was actually so happy that he granted this company exclusive rights to trade with Russia. So Richard Chancellor happily goes back to England, and he wants to tell the good news to King Edward, and he is no longer alive. And by that time, the Bloody Mary was on the throne, which was not exactly good news, as I learned from Helen Watson on her tour. because she was a Catholic and Richard Chancellor was a Protestant, and she managed to slaughter a lot of Protestants when she got to the throne, including Lady Jane Grey, who was the queen for just 79 days, and she was actually married to the son of the head of the Merchants Adventurers Company. So Richard Chancellor was kind of nervous to meet Bloody Mary, but she turned out to be a fairly reasonable lady. She realized that this is a great opportunity to trade with Russia, and so she gives Richard Chancellor all the papers and all the documents that were necessary to trade with Russia. And so he goes back to Moscow, Moscovia. The country was then called Moscovia. And he meets Ivan the Terrible again. And this time he brings some products. Products from England. What were some of the most important export of England of the 17th, 16th century? Wool, absolutely. Wool and very high quality fabrics. And then this is basically how trading begins. Richard Chancellor then goes back to England again, and this time he brings a Russian ambassador with him. Unfortunately, Richard does not survive the crash of the ship, because just when they got to the Scotland area, the shores of Scotland, there was a big storm, and so unfortunately Richard Chancellor did not survive. But the ambassador from Russia did, although he didn't know how to swim. This was his first time traveling, at sea, and miraculously he did survive, and he even managed to keep the documents with him from the Tsar. So yeah, that's kind of a miracle if you think about it. So he is taken to the court. He's presented to the English court, and the official diplomatic relations begin from there. Can we have the next slide, please? This is just a very famous picture, which is a reconstruction by Андрея of the 16th century Moscow. We have the next slide. And this is what London looked like according to an engraving. So around 16th century times. Next one. So the company gets new name. The company is now called the Muscovy Company. And actually, until 1698, the company had monopoly over trade with Russia. And Ivan the Terrible grants the company a beautiful building very close to the Kremlin. And we all know this building because it has survived to the present day. The building is called the Old English Court, St.AndrewsChurch, which is located on Varvarka Street, just across from Zaryadye Park. And it is a 15th century chamber, boyar chambers, with beautiful interiors. Those of you who haven't been to this amazing museum, I strongly recommend that you go. They have a beautiful exhibition, and it's very historic, very atmospheric, so very much recommended. And this is actually a picture of the interiors of the museum. And the interesting fact is that the Muscovy Company still exists. It's no longer a business company, it's no longer a trading company, but it is a charity. And they still pay a little money towards the St.AndrewsChurch and, the priests of St.AndrewsChurch. Okay. Can we have that slide, please? Just a few words about England in late 16th century. Now, the kings and queens that I've already mentioned, Edward VI and Bloody Mary, belonged to the Tudor dynasty. Now, they didn't make a large contribution, but one person who was very important was, of course, Queen Elizabeth. And she introduced a lot of very important reforms, including an agricultural reform, industrial reform, also, she largely contributed to developing the international trade. And this was the time of great flourishing of the arts and also the beginning of the English Renaissance. So we would like to perform two songs that are quintessentially English Renaissance songs. One of them is called Can She Excuse My Wrongs? This song was composed by John Doland, who was a very, very famous composer and poet of the late 16th, early 17th century. And we're going to perform it in early modern English. Can we have this next slide, please? Thank you very much. Right, so Can She Excuse My Wrongs? Late 16th century English Renaissance.
She excuse my wrongs with virtue's glow.
was sung in Shakespearean English, or as we call it, early modern English. Can we have the next slide, please? Yes, we would also like to sing another song of about the same time, and also composed by John Dowland, which is called Flow My Tears. And just one quick second.
Forever
Can we have the next slide, please, Mark? Thank you. Oh, actually, yeah, this is, I cannot not tell you about this interesting episode in our history. Now, we all know that Ivan the Terrible was in correspondence with Queen Elizabeth I. And my question to you is, why do you think he proposed? Because he did propose marriage to Queen Elizabeth. Why do you think he did that? No clue? Well, basically for two reasons. One, of course, is political influence and political ambitions, but also because, and this is what a lot of researchers and historians believe, was that he was actually considering that he could seek shelter in England in case he had to flee from Russia. Yes, no, this is actually true because we can see some of this, the evidence of this in some of the historical documents and correspondence. But Queen Elizabeth was a very smart woman. She used engagements for political influence. However, she never got married, as far as I'm concerned, because she was generally very opposed to the whole concept of marriage. Her father, Henry VIII, had 6 wives, and those marriages were not happy ones. In fact, he executed Queen Elizabeth's mother, so she did not have very good associations with the whole idea of marriage. But she was smart enough to get engaged and then use these engagements for political purposes and influences. And of course, did she say yes or no to Ivan the Terrible? No. Yes, she did refuse, and he was very hurt. He was very disappointed. He stopped correspondence, and he wrote, well, first he wrote he gave her a piece of her mind. And then he stopped corresponding with her for a while, but I don't believe that they resumed correspondence in a while. In any case, that is the story behind their relationship. And we are moving on to the 17th century, and we have some dramatic events in the 17th century, as Mike is laughing. Because, yes, this was the time of a diplomatic crisis between Russia and England. Why? Because in 1649, King Charles I is executed in England. And, well, he was a Scot, and this was basically the beginning of the problems between the two countries. Basically, it chilled Russian-English relations, and Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich takes away all the privileges from the Muscovy Company, and the old English court is actually taken away from the English people as well, and it's given to the Boyar Moslavsky, who was the Tsar's relative. And yes, so that was the situation around the time. However, this was also the time when Scots began coming to Russia. Can you guess why? Suddenly, why Scottish people are suddenly coming to Russia in quite big numbers? This was actually, well, partly because, well, when King Charles was beheaded, the Scottish people began to feel unsafe and uncomfortable in their own country. So actually a lot of them start leaving the British Isles and going to Europe, and some of them went to as far as Russia. The reason why they came to Russia was because they were very highly praised here for their military competence and valor. In fact, Alexei Mikhailovich was already hiring Scottish military people to serve in the Russian army, and then his son, Peter the Great, continued this lovely tradition. And so can we have the next slide, please, Mike? Yes. Actually, there was a Scotsman called George Ogilvy. Am I pronouncing it right? George Ogilvy?
Ogilvy.
I'm sorry?
Ogilvy.
Ogilvy, thank you. Who was an incredible person in Russia. He made a brilliant military career. At some point, he became commander-in-chief of the Russian army. He actually tried to even introduce some military reforms. He was the man behind the troop list. He introduced the first troop list in the Russian army, and he was a favorite with Peter the Great. And he was not the only one. So we now want to sing a beautiful Scottish song that is called Loch Lomond, or the full name is The Bonny Banks of Loch Lomond. This is a very well-known traditional Scottish song, first published in the 19th century, but it actually goes back in time. And the song features Loch Lomond, which is the biggest lake in Scotland. Now, there's a very interesting story behind this song, and there are several theories and interpretations of the symbolism behind this song. And so one of the interpretations is that it basically has to do with the events of the Jacobite rebellion in England. And what happened was, basically that's one of the theories, that the song was sung by a lover of one of the rebels who was then executed in London. And what they did was they would exhibit, this is a horrible thing to say, but that's basically what happened. They would sort of display heads of executed people along the highway between London and Edinburgh. And then the simple folk would travel along the low road back home. Because we have a verse in the song which says, "Oh, you'll take the high road, and I'll take the low road, and I'll be in Scotland afore you." Afore you means before you, but me and my true love will never meet again on the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond. Bonny means beautiful. So that's actually why some people believe, well, that's the symbolism behind the song. So we're going to sing it to you right now. And ready? Thank you very much. So that was one of our personal favorites, this beautiful Scottish song. And we are moving on to, moving on. And into the 18th century, where we have a revival of the English-Russian relations, luckily. So basically, at the end of the 17th century, Peter the Great goes to Europe and happily explores the European ways, and he also visits England. So in 1698, he visits England, and what he does is he starts to invite English merchants, military people, but also engineers, professors, sailors, to go and work and live in Russia. And so these people begin to come to Russia and live here, first in Moscow and later St. Petersburg. And this may not be a very well-known fact, but at that point, English specialists were already having a profound influence on so many, in so many different ways in Russia. They were helping develop the Russian fleet, the Russian army. They also had their influence on some of the reforms, including the church reform, financial reform, administrative reform, and they also helped set up factories and build industry in Russia. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, in the early 18th century, what we have a very important event. The capital is moved from Moscow to St. Petersburg, and of course, a lot of British people and merchants especially move to St. Petersburg because obviously it was much easier to trade through a port. And so Moscow becomes, but still Moscow is has a fairly big community of English and Scottish people. But from this time onwards, a lot of English families assimilate in Russia. They take Russian names. Most of them maintain their English traditions. They go to pray in Anglican churches. But they really do call Russia their second home. This little document actually proves, well, if you can read some of the names, including Yakov Koli, for instance. These names were put on one of the Russian documents, and these were actually signed by the English people. But they wrote Russian. They would write their names in Russian. So, for instance, Yakov Koli, was this Jacob? Michael, what do you think? Yeah. Jacob, yeah, so Jacob Koli probably. Yeah, so he would write his name as Yakov Koli in Russian. However, like I said, most families keep their English traditions, their English ways, and also their religion. Have the next slide. In the 18th century, now this was a very special time in Russia. This is especially connected to the reign of the Tsarina, Catherine II, who was a very extravagant lady. And so this is the time of great extravagance and luxury of the Russian court. And this is when we begin to invite a lot of British architects and landscape designers and park designers to help us build magnificent palaces and beautiful parks in St. Petersburg, especially. And basically, this is when a new wave of English people arrive in Russia. So in a way, you can say that there were waves of British people coming to Russia. First, there were merchants and adventurers. Then we had Scots. Then we had, engineers, military people, but also architects and designers. And if we go forward a bit, we want to sing another song, which is called Skyboat. It is a folk song. And this is an 18th century song, and it has to do with the events of the Jacobite Rising. The song basically gives an account of how Bonnie Prince Charlie escaped, after the Jacobite, after the defeat of the Jacobite rising, he escapes in a small boat. Okay. And we are ready to perform this song for you right now. It's okay. Okay, are we ready? Back to the 18th century, which is basically a Scots Gaelic song, and the story behind it is basically that the song was written by a Scottish woman, and the song conveys very strong and sad emotions of a woman who is waiting for her lover, the boatman, to come back. So, are we ready?
ocean I sail to sea. Will come tonight, love, will come tomorrow. Will telephone love to comfort me. Firemata loro e la firemata loro e la firemata loro e la. A thousand blessings they call the fatal, they call the false one, and seek to change me, but on in vain. For thou art my dream all through the night, and every morning I scan the way. Firamata loro e la firamata loro e la firamata loro e la. A thousand blessings wherever. There's not a hamlet, the well I know it, where you come wandering or set a mile. But from the old home you've been with talking, and charm's maidens with song and smile. Firemata loro e la firemata loro e la firemata loro e la. A thousand blessings wherever. Dost thou remember the promise made me, that autumn lady, the silken gown, that ring of gold with thy head and portrait, that golden ring I'll never know. Firemata loro e la
And we are moving on into the 19th century. And let's take a look at what's going on with the English community in the 19th century. Now, basically, sorry, of course, not the 18th, but the 19th century is the time of the Industrial Revolution in Russia. And this is when we start building industries, setting up factories, plants. And so we have another wave of English people coming and setting up their factories and businesses in Russia, Moscow and St. Petersburg. These are engineers and industrialists. Now, a lot of, this is also the time when we begin to build our railroads and railways. And there is an interesting fact that the father of the famous painter, English painter, James Whistler, was actually behind building the railway, the first railway between Moscow and St. Petersburg. He was the engineer who was behind that construction. And towards middle 19th century, we have a lot of prominent British, English and Scottish families in Moscow and St. Petersburg that have a lot of power, influence. They own a lot of property in Russia, they own factories, and they help develop industries. So some of the most prominent families were the McGills, the Smiths, and the Gibsons. Is there a connection, Mike? Possibly, we can look into it. Yes, the McGills were particularly influential. And this was a very important Scottish family living in Moscow. And they were great contributors. They were very active in the British community. They did a lot of charity work, but they also were some of the biggest contributors towards constructing St. Andrew's Church. If we move, I just want to say a very quick fact about the Smiths, because Richard Smith, who started a boilers factory in Moscow, there is a street in Moscow called Shmitovsky Proyezd. Well, actually, it used to be Smitovsky Proyezd, after the name of this English industrialist. And it was then renamed after the revolution, because there was a revolutionist called Schmidt, and that's actually why they renamed the street. But it used to be Smitovsky Proyezd, like I said, named after this English, very important, very prominent English businessman in Russia. I want to say a few more words about another, let's say, wave of English people who came to Russia in great numbers in the 19th century. These were the governesses, because this was a time when all English was in great fashion, and all aristocratic families in Moscow and St. Petersburg would often have a French and an English governess. And because there were too many of them in their home country, a lot of them would go outside the country, and many would come to Russia because they were treated very well in Russia. And so they were very handsomely paid, and some of them would come for a few years, but end up staying here forever. And some of them also served as companions, personal companions to the ladies that they used to teach. Some of these ladies would never get married, and so the English governesses would then stay their lifelong companions. And so a lot of them would actually stay in Russia for good. Can we move on to the next slide? Yeah, just a very quick fact about football, because football was, of course, brought to Russia by the English, and the first football matches were played on English factories in Moscow. Why? Well, one reason was because English people they're always, they're very athletic, they love sports, and the first sport they introduced was rugby. But rugby is somewhat rough, and Russian policemen in particular were not very happy with such a rough sport. So what happens is they then start playing football, and the first football matches were played on the English factories. And in fact, they gave rise to football in Russia and nurtured some of the famous Russian football teams. Interesting fact, I think. We want to sing a song which is not really, is it a 19th century song, really, Santiano?
I think it's a bit older.
It's a bit older, yeah. Can we have the next slide, please, Mike? Oh, right. Okay, just carry on. Kind of set this. Right. So we're going to sing a song which represents a very interesting genre, which is called sea shanty or sea shanties. The reason why we decided to sing this song is because, well, this is a folk genre, and these songs were sung by sailors on ships, big vessels, usually trade vessels, to help synchronize the work on the vessels. So rowing, for instance, and economize labor. And they were very, very popular, these songs. And it also kind of symbolizes the song in particular and the lyrics of the songs, which you're gonna read. Actually, I don't have them, sorry. But this song kind of symbolizes the entrepreneurial spirit of the English, of the British. In this particular song, the sailors sing that how they are going to Mexico, California, I'm sorry, in search of gold.
In this version of this text, they're going to seek gold.
Right.
So they were seeking adventure, they were adventurous, and so the gold fever was one of the main attractions of this time.
Right. Okay, so Santiano.
Okay, it's ready? The shantyman used to improvise that. I'm not going to improvise it right now, so I'm going to try my best to be a good shantyman. If her up and away we'll go, away, Santiano. If her up and away we'll go, we both for California. So if her up and away we'll go, away, Santiano. So if her up and away we'll go, we both for California. If her up and away we'll go, away, Santiano. So if her up and away we'll go,
you. And moving on into the 20th century. Yes, everything went well until the Soviet Revolution. Unfortunately, during the revolution, things began falling apart, and many British families had a lot of property, a lot of land in Moscow, in St. Petersburg. They have built their homes here, they had their families here, and a lot of English people, British people, never left Russia. They never went to their original country, but they were now forced to leave their home. And some people, some English people chose to not leave Russia, although these were very few, and some chose to come back. Now, I have learned an interesting fact from Helen Watson, who told her, I'm not sure she shared this with you during the tour, but she learned of a story of a British lady whose family owned a carpet family in Moscow, and so she managed to escape after the 1920, but she came back because basically she felt like she couldn't leave, and so she stayed here, well, in Russia until 1931 when she died, and for some time she even worked at her own factory, which she used to own, but she worked as an accountant, simply. And so we're going to sing another song, which is kind of symbolic because this is an immigrant song written in Nova Scotia, Canada, by a Scottish composer. And the song is basically about love for the new homeland, but also praise and love of the homeland itself, which was Scotland. And An Inish Eye is the name of the song, which translates as the Happy Island. So An Inish Eye.
Vigilia
Russia. And in 1994, something very important happened. Queen Elizabeth II visits Moscow, and she takes part in several important events. She takes part in the opening of the Old English Court Museum opening ceremony, and she also manages to see the president, Boris Yeltsin, and she asked something from him. Now, what did she ask for? Does anybody know? Yes, she asked Boris Yeltsin to give the church back to the English, and he promised that he would, and he did. It took quite some time to do the paperwork and to sort of have all the legal procedures, but as I see Pat nodding because she knows this story better than I do, but apparently the official process of getting the church back to the Anglican Church took place when, Pat? 2016, so 2016, a couple of years ago, the church was officially returned to the Anglican Church, right? Yes. Basically, yes. But the services have been conducted regularly since the 90s, and today there are regular Wednesday and Sunday services conducted in the church. There are also lots of cultural events that take place in St. Andrew's Church, including Christmas fairs, and actually many more events that all of you are welcome to. And the new British expats, people living in Russia are, of course, business and financial consultants, but also teachers and private tutors of English. There are lots of English tutors living now in Moscow, maybe fewer in St. Petersburg, but just generally in Russia. And some of the socializing centers for the British in Moscow are, well, St. Andrew's Church and some of the pubs. I can let you on a little secret. If you want to meet a lot of British people in Moscow, go to Chicago Prime. That is the place to go to meet the British in Moscow. I want to quickly go over some of the architectural highlights that are directly connected to the British in Russia, in Moscow actually, because we are in Moscow. I don't want to waste too much of your time, but just to quickly go over some of the landmarks. The first one, of course, is the Old English Court. Mike, can you have the next slide? The Old English Court, I already mentioned it today a few times. It's a very important building which once belonged to the English, but was then taken away from them. Today it is a museum of English culture and history, and it has been reconstructed in the 70s of the 20th century, thanks to the great efforts of Pyotr Baranovsky, who basically gave it a second wind. Because the building was completely unrecognizable in the 20th century. It changed many owners. At one point, it was even a mathematical school, which was established by Peter the Great. But it used to go from one owner to another. It used to belong to the state for a while. And then, because every owner would change a little something and add a little something to the building, by the middle 20th century, it was completely unrecognizable. It was thanks to Peter Baranovsky, who was a famous That's the only word I'm struggling with in English. someone who helped reconstruct and restore original buildings. He basically rediscovered it, and he helped preserve it and rebuild it. Unfortunately, what you see today is not the entirely original building. The foundation is original, and some of the elements are original, but because some of there were documents surviving of what the building looked like. So luckily they were able to fully reconstruct it, but in fact it is a kind of a replica. It's not 100% original building. Another important building, landmark, can we have the next slide? Is actually it's not really a building, but it's the clock on the Savior's Tower. The first clock with chimes was put in 1620s, and this was a work by a Scottish clock master, Christopher Holloway, and unfortunately the original 17th clock did not survive. The next interesting landmark is the Soon department store, or the so-called Muir and Merrill's Company. This store actually belonged to the two Scotsmen who set up the first large department store in Moscow, and it was a revolution in shopping because they introduced the European style of shopping with beautiful windows, lovely exhibits and expositions of products, and beautiful catalogs of products. So it was a miracle. It was the first department store in Moscow. And of course it was nationalized after the revolution. And today it's one of the fanciest high-end department stores in Russia. Another building is the English Club in Tverskaya, which is not really the English club, but it was one of the first English clubs in Moscow. Actually, the tradition of English clubs dates back to the 18th century in Russia, and they were first set up in St. Petersburg, because this was when the fashion for everything English and the gentleman clubs comes to Russia. And in the 19th century, we already have some of these clubs in Moscow. And so this was one of the fanciest clubs, where, of course, Russian aristocrats went, only men, but also foreigners. A lot of foreigners and English people would come to this club and spend time here, socialize, etc., etc. And today, this is the Modern History Museum. I'm sorry, this is the Museum of Modern Russian History, but they do have some reconstructed interiors of the original, well, it's just a part of the English club, the way it used to be in the 19th century, but you can still go and see those reconstructed interiors today. So in case you haven't, I strongly recommend that you do, because they are beautiful. Next landmark is the, well, of course, yes, the St.AndrewsChurch. We talked about it a lot today. Those of you who did not go on a tour where Helen Wasson talked in great detail about the history of the church, I'm just going to say a few quick words about this beautiful building. Mike, can you go to the next slide, please? It was built in late 19th century. This was a project by Richard Neil Freeman, who was a British architect, and he was hired by the English people living in Moscow, who all chipped in to fund the construction of the church. After the revolution, this was a Finnish embassy, just for a little while, and then it housed Melodia Sound Recording Company, which is a well-known fact, partly because of its beautiful acoustics. And in 1994, as I already mentioned, Queen Elizabeth II meets Boris Yeltsin, and the church is returned back to the English. So like I said today, this church is a very active social center, and lots and lots of expats, not just English people, but many other expats living in Moscow come and partake in the many events that the church hosts. Next slide, please. One more interesting landmark is the Marco Polo Hotel, which used to be St. Andrew's House of Governesses in Spiridonevsky Pereulok. This house was built in early 20th century, and this was basically the house for English and American governesses. And it was funded by Jane McGill, who was the wife of the famous industrialist from Scotland. Like I said, this was a very wealthy Scottish family, one of the most influential families and very active members in the British community in Moscow. And Robert McGill helped develop the Russian textile industry. He owned a large textile factory in Moscow. And in the Soviet times, this building was turned into a hotel for these party elite. And today, it's known as the Marco Polo Hotel. But interestingly, one of the suites in the hotel, one of the luxury rooms, bears the name of Jane McGill. Yes, Mike, this is actually true. And can I have the next slide? We're going to finish our program for tonight with a song called The Parting Glass. Now, a parting glass is a traditional song which is very popular in Ireland and Scotland. And this song was often and is often sung at the end of a gathering of friends when the last glass was given to those departing to give them the energy for their trip back home. So, the parting glass.
I spent it in good company, and all the harm that Sarah done, all I see was too long.
program and it wasn't too tedious. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Question.
Yes?
Sorry, where can I buy a CD?
I'm sorry?
Where can I buy a CD?
Good question. We do not have the CDs yet, but they're hopefully coming. You can leave the email and I will let you know as soon as we have them. Thank you. Thank you for your interest. Any other questions? Yes.
Could you tell us what was the language of...
An interesting question. As far as I'm concerned, well, I mean, obviously, Ivan the Terrible did not write in English, so his letters would be translated to Queen Elizabeth, as far as I remember.
I'm sorry, as far as I know, they have their correspondence in Latin.
Yes, that's true. Oh, yes, you're right.
The letters were all in Latin, so...
I believe that's, I'm not sure if all the letters were in Latin, but...
well, mostly.
Right. Okay, well, if you wish to stay for another few minutes, we can sing a couple more songs, maybe. Okay, we're going to sing another song which we have performed on various occasions. It is a song dating back to the early 14th century, and it will be sung in Middle English. It's called Brido na brere, which means a song on a tree branch. Thank you, Mike. Very impressive. Yes, we actually had it on the program, but we excluded it at some point. So, Brido na brere. You can follow the modern English translation if it helps anybody. And of course, listen to the original Middle English, which we try to reconstruct, and we do our best to do it. I think that's probably it for tonight. Thank you so much for coming and for your has taken part in the program. A big thanks to another round of applause to Franziska Kabrul. Follow our programs on the website, and we actually have another program coming, which is a Christmas program. We're going to be performing at St. Andrew's, at Moscow State Acoustic University. I'm not sure if it's going to be an open event, and there might be an event at the Old English Court on November 23rd. So stay tuned, follow the website, and again, thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you for your interest. And